In Part 2, we continue to explore how the One Big Beautiful Bill could reshape energy markets, influence investment decisions, and impact the race to power the AI economy.
Aaron, you've done some modeling that suggests repealing a couple of sections of the tax credits, 45Y and 48E, will raise electricity prices. And is some of the research that you're seeing or have done suggests that, I mean, we are clearly seeing a rise in electricity prices, and I'd also suggest a lower reliability environment as well in some of our major ISO power markets. How can you expand on, what the implications of those two repeals are?
Well, we did modeling, actually, we did it back in March, so it was before the final OB3. So I do want to emphasize that we did not explicitly model the bill. We modeled the repeal of, as you said, the 45Y and 48E tax credits. These are we call the tech neutral tax credits for clean electricity. So these are an investment and a production tax credit for technologies that are deemed to be clean. And what we did see was an increase in electricity rates, maybe 5 to 7% across the country. It did vary by region, increases in bills, $75, maybe $150, in some regions higher than that. I always want to emphasize, I know it's some pedantic, but, these are all projections. We're not making predictions here. And, all these models simplify things a lot, but it does sort of, we think, capture part of what we would expect to happen with bill repeal. I would say, though, like if you look at the increases in electricity prices right now, I would not want to attribute those certainly solely or even in majority to the repeal of the IRA. I mean, the things with the IRA we expect to happen over time as, you would see the fewer renewables be built. I think if you look at sort of what's happening now, that there's a lot more sort of near-term things that are impacting what's being seen. There's like a Berkeley study that was very interesting at Lawrence Berkeley Labs that looked at a lot of the drivers there.
Phil, what are your thoughts on, I think you've kind of answered this, but are you seeing some of the same things Aaron is and with the higher prices and lower reliability, and how does this play out from your perspective?
So, let's kind of like break this down a little bit. So to answer kind of the last part, or not even the reliability part, but just kind of like cost part, I agree with Aaron that we're not really seeing the impacts on cost yet, just because like this happened in July, the subsidies are still in effect. This is going to happen over time where we start to see that. A lot of the costs that we're seeing now is driven by other factors, whether that's permitting issues or other cost issues and barriers to market entry. So getting to kind of Aaron's point, so I got a couple questions for Aaron because I want to make sure I get this correct. This is the haiku power sector model you used, right? And what was the assumed pass-through rate for the subsidies?
100%.
100%.
I didn't realize we were going to get deep into modeling.
And
Let's go.
What was the assumed permitting restrictions or barriers to market entry? Were those modeled in that?
It doesn't model permitting barriers. I should say we do model haircuts for the
3% haircut, right?
For the subsidies. I don't have the number at the top of my head right now, some of the modeling details. But yeah, we do model haircuts, both for tax equity and the transferability issues.
I'm just a big nerd is what it is. So the point is, I agree completely with Aaron and kind of this idea of, hey, you pull back these subsidies, you're going to increase costs and you're going to have higher electricity bills as a result. But what I think is important is the sort of modeling exercise shows us, hey, here's kind of like this idealized scenario where you're assuming that there are no barriers to the entry of new resources, and you're assuming that all of the subsidies are going to get passed on to consumers. So on kind of the former point of the permitting, when they survey renewable energy developers, say, why are your projects getting canceled? So the Hamilton project did this. Local ordinances are the number one issue, interconnections number two. Way down at the very bottom, less than 10% of these canceled projects, it's because of financing, which is the only thing that subsidies really can impact. So it's kind of a question like, okay, are the deployments really restricted by that? Or is it the subsidies that are making more deployment, or is it because of permitting? It's hard to know a specific answer, but I think that we can't assume that there's no impact there. On the other point, on this pass-through, in tax policy, there's this idea of like tax incidence, which is kind of important. So everyone knows tax incidence because when you go to a store, you pay a sales tax, but you're not reporting the sales tax to the IRS. It's the store you bought it from is the one that's reporting it, and they're giving the revenue to the IRS. You have the inverse for subsidies. So the subsidized entity wants to keep as much of the subsidy as possible, and they want to pass through as little to the customers. How much they pass through is going to depend a lot on the supply side and how many competitors there are. If there are a lot of subsidized entities and they're all competing for business, they're going to pass through a lot of that. And I think you do have some markets where you see that, especially like Texas, where you have very competitive markets. But then you have regulated monopolies where they don't have any reason to pass through that cost. They have regulations which might say you can only increase the cost by this much, but they're going to try to increase their book value to retain as much of the value as possible. So when we look at kind of the data of this, what we see is, one is you don't see as much renewable deployment as was predicted. Because to Aaron's point, these are projections. They're not, like set in stone. These are just kind of, hey, if everything goes right, here's what you get. And we always know we're not going to reach that point, but we're like well below that point. So that kind of makes me doubt a lot of the benefits in terms of like new deployment reducing costs. And I'm also, just kind of like all of the factors that we expect to mitigate the effectiveness of the subsidies seem to be at play here. So that's what kind of makes me more skeptical of it. But to Aaron's point, like I agree with everything conceptually. I'm just kind of like, you're at that 100%. I'm like, okay, maybe we're at like the 25%, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I don't want to put forth sort of false precision. Modeling is an exercise. I would say that historically the errors have gone both ways. You can see prior modeling significantly underestimate the amount of renewable energy deployment as well. So, but this is uncertain. And as I said, the tool for modeling is to understand like sort of the economics of how policy changes are made. It's not to say this is definitely, so-and-so in North Dakota will see a $300 increase. I would never claim that, but it is, really directionally, it helps you understand, potential impacts of policies.
Yeah, so the premise of the podcast is basically a lack of shareholder or stakeholder alignment from team government to team big tech, to team power industry, into the team existing grid customer who is being affected by what's happening through this. From your perspective, can you guys just speak to, did OB3 provide any clarity or help around alignment to get those stakeholders closer together where you can actually, activate this both economically and societal, point of view for the best outcome? And if not, what would you change or alter in the approach, at least from the federal government?
I mean, I think what is hard is just the uncertainty. I mean, I think one of the goals with the Inflation Reduction Act was to provide more uncertainty about these tax credits. These tax credits have been around for a while. Often they would have 1 year or 2 year expiration dates, and they would be renewed. And, it was very challenging for investors. You'd see like spikes in people starting construction in like December because they wanted to get under the date. And one of the goals with the IRA was to sort of reduce that uncertainty. But now a lot of these things are going away. And there's uncertainty in some of the regulations, just as there was uncertainty in the regulations that Treasury had to issue with the IRA tax credits. With the repeal and some of the new provisions, there's going to be uncertainty. And then, the next administration will change again. It's just, it just makes it very hard to plan long term when sort of you can have these huge swings in policy.
Yep.
Yeah.
Phil?
The certainty, I think, is something that shouldn't be underappreciated here. It's really hard to make investment decisions that span 5-10 years, beyond any single administration when you don't really know what the environment is going to be. One thing on the IRA, though, I would say the approach of the IRA as a remedy to that uncertainty was not the right approach, just because it was a completely partisan bill. And not only that, they didn't have a hearing on it. Like, it wasn't like, okay, we're going to build up this discussion, get buy-in from industry, build the political consensus. It was, okay, we got Joe Manchin's vote, let's ram this through. That's not the way you build certainty for industry. And it's not really that surprising to me that that it got repealed in the way it did. The one thing that is surprising to me is that the repeal happened to the extent it did, just because there is a certain longevity to a lot of these subsidies. But that partisanship is never the solution to provide certainty. So I think that, in terms of like any kind of benefit of building this kind of like consensus or understanding, I think that there's at least a bit of appreciation now for some of the proponents of the IRA of like, hey, this was not the right approach. We really need to build that consensus and that buy-in to make this stuff last, rather than saying we're going to make this a political issue. And it's always going to be a political issue when it becomes partisan. And I think that's just kind of what we're seeing now with these subsidies.
IRA was interesting because while it was partisan, when you look at the majority of the economic activity, it went to Texas, or would typically be considered a red state, and probably not on board with the IRA, but yet it not only gave us that economic activity, but it gave us really very affordable electricity prices that are still there, and just a massive amount of the incentives went into the Texas economy. So it's just kind of weird how it started one way and ended up, economically landing somewhere else and benefiting maybe the constituents that weren't so much behind the bill.
Well, I can give a little more insight on that.
Yeah.
Because I think that that's kind of a key point, is that there was this strategy of, hey, I think the Breakthrough Institute called it the green vortex strategy, which is get as much of the subsidies in the red states to build this kind of consensus after the political stuff already happened.
Interesting.
But when you look at OBBBA, it wasn't primarily an energy reform bill. Like, this is really about making the tax provisions from the TCJA permanent. So as kind of like a quick and dirty explanation of tax policy debates in Washington, Congress, whenever they're debating a budget, they debate it over 10 years. And when there's a budget instruction, which is how you can get around the filibuster in the Senate and use these budget reconciliation provisions, you are directed to spend or raise a certain amount of money. So they have to operate within this framework. So at the get-go, they say, here's the most amount of deficit increase we're willing to absorb. And then they leave it up to the committees of jurisdiction to find out how they're going to meet those targets. So you look at OBBBA and you look at the cost of extending into permanence these TCJA cuts, which back in 2017, they made them temporary because they're like, oh, we'll just deal with that later because that's politically easier to pass a short term rather than a long term. So they said, okay, well, now let's make it permanent. And there just were not a lot of pay-fors to cover those costs. So when you look at where are those pay-fors, it's just that the IRA subsidies were the easiest thing for Republicans to say, okay, here's where we're going to get the revenue, even though they were benefiting from it. But they knew that it would be a big loss to cave on the other tax provisions.
Aaron, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't want to, well, our fact is not to get too much into the politics, but I do think that looking at the OB3 as part of the full reconciliation package was really important to understand how it ended up, where it ended up, and emphasizing in addition to using these tax pay-fors, they also did things like changing to a current policy baseline. It's very hard to accomplish things under reconciliation process. Everything has to be budget related. One of the reasons the IRA was very focused on budget things is that it was passed under the reconciliation process. And so as you see things move forward in reconciliation and dealing with things like, bird rules and things like that, it maybe means that you don't end up with what maybe an economist would say is the most efficient policy. You have to work within these legislative constraints.
All right, so I'm going to put you guys on the spot.
Great.
OB3, a good thing, bad thing. Under kind of did it provide clarity and more certainty to entice construction of more electricity resources to meet this new demand, regardless of whether it's fossil fuel or renewables or nuclear?
Oh, Scott, you really...
I will be short and wimp out on that one.
that really
I don't
puts
know.
on the spot, right?
Yeah, and that's okay too. Maybe it is. We just don't know yet, right?
There's so many moving parts right now. There's what is the Fed going to do with interest rates? What are tariffs going to be for equipment? There's just so many moving parts right now. I would even generally being reluctant to prognosticate. I'm especially reluctant to prognosticate right now.
Make sure to watch Part 3, where we break down the stakeholder landscape, how state and federal policies collide or come together,